Martha Whitaker knelt in the burning dust and pulled the dying calf against her chest, while Caleb Sterling's men laughed and rode off. "You and me both, little one," she whispered. "They already counted us gone." All of Promise Valley swore she'd buried her last dollar in a runt that wouldn't live till morning. But 2 years on the bull they left to die would bring the richest man in Texas to his knees. Subscribe and follow Martha's story to the very end, and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels. Caleb Sterling looked at the calf lying in the dirt of his calving field and made the decision that would one day cost him everything. "Drag it out to the wash," he said. "Let the coyotes settle the account." The young hand beside him, a boy no older than 17, hesitated with his hand still on the saddle horn. "It's breathing, Mr. Sterling. It's still breathing pretty good." "I can see what it's doing, son. I asked you to do something about it." "Yes, sir. Only it might come around. My daddy always said, give a runt 3 days before you—" "Your daddy runs 40 head on a rock pile and calls himself a rancher." Sterling didn't raise his voice. He never had to. Men in Promise Valley bent to Caleb Sterling the way grass bends before weather, and he had long ago stopped noticing the wind he made. "I run 4,000. You want to know why? Because I don't waste feed on what's already lost. That animal's mother won't claim it can't stand, and it's got a chest on it like a bird. It is a loss. The only foolish thing a man can do with a loss is spend more on it." The boy swallowed. "Yes, sir." "Rope it and haul it off. And Tom, quit looking at me like that. Softness in a man is a leak in a boat. It don't sink you all at once. It sinks you slow on a calm day when you think you're doing fine." He turned his horse. "I'll be at the house." He rode away, and he did not look back, and that was the whole of it as far as he was concerned. A calf too small to live. A morning already spent. He would remember later that he could not even recall the animal's face. That was the part that would keep him awake in the years to come. Not that he'd been cruel, but that it had cost him nothing to be. He hadn't hated the calf. He hadn't felt anything at all. The boy roped it gentle and dragged it slow. And when he was out past the fence line, where no one from the big house could see, he cut it loose in the dry wash and sat on his heels beside it a while. "I'm sorry," he told it. "I truly am. But I need this job worse than you need mercy." Then he rode off too, and left the calf to the sky. Martha Whitaker found it an hour before noon. She had been walking her south fence the way she did every third morning, because a widow with no man and no money learns that the only thing standing between her and ruin is her own 2 eyes on her own thin property. She was 32 years old, and she looked older, and she knew it, and she had stopped caring about it the winter her husband died and left her a cabin, a weak well, and a mortgage note that Caleb Sterling had bought up quiet before the ground on Daniel's grave had even settled. She heard the flies before she saw the calf. Then she saw the vultures, 3 of them riding the heat in a slow, patient wheel, and she knew what that meant, and something in her chest went tight and old and familiar. She climbed the fence. The calf was black, near solid black, with one white spot on its forehead, like a thumbprint God had pressed there and forgotten to finish. Its ribs pumped fast and shallow. Its eyes were half shut against the light. When her shadow fell across it, it flinched and tried to lift its head, and could not. "Easy," Martha said. "Easy now. I ain't one of them." She knelt in the dirt. She put her hand flat against its side and felt the racing of its heart, and she did the math the way any ranch woman does it, without wanting to, too small, too weak. Mother won't have it feed. I don't have time. I can't spare. Every number said the same word. Loss. The whole valley would have said it. Caleb Sterling had already said it, and Caleb Sterling was never wrong about cattle. Everyone knew that it was the one thing about him no one could argue. She looked at the vultures. She looked at the little pumping ribs, and something rose up in her that had nothing to do with math. "They already threw you out," she said softly. "Didn't they? Counted you gone and rode off and didn't even wait to see." The calf's ear twitched at her voice. Martha Whitaker had been counted gone herself. She knew exactly what it felt like to be the loss another person walked away from. She had seen it in the faces at the mercantile and the way the churchwomen lowered their voices and the surveyor Sterling had sent to just have a look at her boundary lines twice already this spring. Everyone in Promise Valley had already done the arithmetic on Martha, and the answer they'd got was that she'd be gone by winter off her land, and no great loss. "You and me both, little one," she whispered. "They already counted us gone." She got her arms under it. It was heavier than it looked, dead weight and bone, and she was not a big woman, but she had buried a husband alone, and pulled a breech calf alone, and she had learned that the body will do what the heart insists on, if the heart insists hard enough. She got it up against her chest. She stood staggered, found her feet. "All right," she said more to herself than the calf. "All right, we're going home." And she carried it. Half a mile in the rising heat, stopping to rest and shift the weight, and start again talking the whole way in a low, steady voice, and by the time she laid it down in the shade of her cabin wall, her arms were shaking, and her dress was soaked through, and she could not have said if you'd asked her why she had done it. Only that she could not have walked past. Some folks are built so they can walk past. Martha wasn't, and it had cost her before, and it would cost her again, and she knew it, and she carried the calf home anyway. Katim. Word travels in a valley, the way fire travels in dry grass. By the next afternoon, Elias Bauer came up her road on his old gray mule, and Martha knew before he opened his mouth that the whole of Promise Valley already had its opinion. Elias was 67, German-born, with hands like tree roots, and an accent the town had never quite forgiven him for. He farmed the poorest quarter section in the valley, and made it produce which the cattlemen found faintly insulting, as though soil that would answer to patience made a mockery of soil that only answered to size. "So," he said, climbing down slow, "it is true then. You have taken in Sterling's dead calf." "It ain't dead." "No." Elias came to the shade and crouched beside the animal with a grunt. He looked at it a long moment, pressed his thumb to its gum, thumbed back an eyelid, laid his ear to the little heaving chest. Martha watched his face, and hated how much she wanted his verdict to be kind. "It is close to dead," he said finally. "Which is a different thing." He looked up at her. "You know what they are saying in town." "I can guess. They are saying the widow Whitaker has finally lost her mind, that she buried her sense with her husband, that Caleb Sterling threw out a runt worth nothing, and the fool woman on the next place carried it home like a baby." He said it flatly, without malice, watching her. Sterling himself is saying it. At the mercantile. He called it, how did he say, coyote meat? He is laughing, Martha. The whole valley is laughing. Martha's jaw set. "Let 'em laugh. You do not have feed for it. You do not have milk. You have a well-going thin and a note on this land that man holds in his own hand." Elias stood slow, his knees cracking. "I am not here to laugh at you. You know this. But I am old, and I have seen many people ruined by a soft heart, and I would not like to see it happen to you. This calf will die anyway, most likely. And you will have spent what little you have and given that man one more reason to point at your door and say, there is a woman who cannot manage." For a moment, Martha said nothing. She looked at the calf. It had lifted its head an inch, and it was looking back at her, and there was in its dark eye something that was not asking to be saved exactly, but that was watching her the way the drowning watch the shore. "Elias," she said, "when Daniel died and the note came due and I couldn't pay it, you know what Sterling's man told me? He said it real polite. He said, 'Mrs. Whitaker, it ain't personal, it's just arithmetic. You're a loss. Best thing you can do is take the offer and go.'" She turned to the old man. "A loss. That's the word. Same word Sterling used on this calf, I'd wager. Same tone even." She crouched and put her hand on the black flank. "I ain't going, and neither's he. Maybe that makes us both fools. But I'd sooner be a live fool than a smart woman who let a thing die just because a rich man told her the numbers didn't work out." Elias looked at her for a long time. Something in his weathered face shifted. Not agreement exactly, but a kind of recognition, one stubborn soul knowing another. Then he sighed the enormous, put-upon sigh of a man about to do more work than he wanted to. "Egg," he said. "What? Egg, lard, molasses. Warm water, not hot warm like for a baby. My grandmother's mixture in the old country for the lambs, the ewe refuses." He was already rolling up his sleeves. "If you are going to be a fool, Martha Whitaker, at least be a fool who does it correctly. Bring me a clean bottle and the softest rag you own. And do not tell anyone in that town I helped you, or they will laugh at me also, and I am too old to fight them all." Martha's eyes stung sudden and hot, and she turned quick so he wouldn't see. "Thank you, Elias." "Do not thank me yet," he said grimly, kneeling by the calf. "Thank me if it lives, and it will not live, but we will try." He glanced up at her, and just for an instant the corner of his hard mouth moved. "We will try very hard." That first night Martha did not sleep. She sat on the dirt floor with the calf's head in her lap and dribbled the warm mixture between its lips a drop at a time, and when it choked she stopped, and when it swallowed she near wept with relief. And she talked to it the whole night through in the low, steady voice, because Elias had told her a rejected animal needs to hear a heartbeat and a voice, or it gives up having decided the world has no place set for it. "You listen to me." She told it around 2 in the morning, when its breathing had gone so shallow she'd twice put her hand to its chest, certain it had stopped. "You don't get to quit. You hear I carried you half a mile. My arm still ain't right from it. You do not get to make a liar out of me by dying now, after I told that whole valley I'd keep you." She wiped its muzzle with the rag. "You got a name coming if you make it to morning. A live thing needs a name. But I ain't wasting a good name on a calf that dies in the dark, so you just hold on and earn it." Toward dawn, the little animal shuddered and Martha's heart seized, and then it sighed a long trembling sigh, and its breathing steadied and deepened, and it slept. Truly slept. Not the shallow slipping away of the night, but real sleep, the sleep of something that has decided against the whole weight of the world's opinion to live. Martha put her forehead down against its warm neck and let herself shake. "That white spot," she murmured, "right there on your forehead, like a button. That's what you are then, button." She laughed wet and quiet, half a sob. "Ain't much of a name for a bull, but you weren't much of a bull, so I reckon we're square." When the sun came up, she carried the news to Elias herself, walking the 2 miles to his place, because she had no horse to spare, and could not have sat still anyhow. The old man met her at his gate. He read her face before she spoke. "It lived," he said. "It lived. It drank near a full bottle at dawn. It stood Elias, wobbled up on its own 4 legs, and stood there looking at me like it was daring me to be surprised." Elias Bauer, who had told her plainly and repeatedly that the calf would die, looked away toward his own poor fields for a moment and worked his jaw. And when he looked back, his old eyes were suspiciously bright. "Well," he said gruffly, "do not make too much of one morning. Anything can die in the second week that lived through the first." But he was already reaching for his hat. "I will come and look at it, to be certain you have not simply propped a dead calf against the wall out of stubbornness." Jedid. The mockery started in earnest that Sunday at church, which was where Promise Valley did most of its judging. Martha felt it the moment she stepped inside the small stirring, the heads turning, the whispers passed hand to hand down the pews like a collection plate. She kept her chin level and took her usual place in the back and stared at the front of the room and did not give them the satisfaction of a flinch. Afterward in the yard, Caleb Sterling was holding court by his fine black buggy, the way he always did. Hat pushed back, thumbs in his vest, and the men of the valley gathered loose around him, the way filings gather to a lodestone. He saw Martha coming out, and he raised his voice just enough, just exactly enough, that she would be sure to hear. "And I said, boys, I said let the coyotes have it, it's a loss, and you know what happened to it?" A pause timed like a card sharp. The widow Whitaker carried it home in her arms. Laughter easy and cruel. "Fed it out of a bottle, I hear. Sat up with it all night like a sick child. Now that is a woman who understands ranching. That is where I've been going wrong, boys. I've been selling my cattle. Turns out I should have been nursing the ones that can't stand. The laughter rolled again, and Martha felt the heat climb her neck, and she made herself keep walking slow and even toward her wagon. But Sterling wasn't finished. He never was finished until he'd drawn blood. Mrs. Whitaker. He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy, and the whole yard went quiet to watch. I hear you've adopted my cast-off. Well, I won't be small about it. You keep the coyote meat, ma'am, free and clear. Consider it a gift. Lord knows you've little enough to your name. One worthless calf, more or less, won't change your standing. He smiled, and it was a handsome smile, and it did not reach his eyes. Though if you find yourself wanting to give up this ranching business and move along to somewhere kinder, you'll recall I'm always ready to talk terms on that little parcel of yours, neighborly terms. It's a hard land for a woman alone, no shame in admitting it. There it was, under the mockery, the real thing. It had never once been about the calf. It had always been about her land, that thin strip of green that touched his boundary and carried through the valley, didn't yet know it the last live water for a mile in any direction. Martha stopped. She turned. And in front of the whole of Promise Valley, she looked Caleb Sterling in the eye. Mr. Sterling, she said, and her voice did not shake, and later folks would remember that it did not shake. I thank you kindly for the calf. That's a fine gift, and I mean to make good use of it. She let that sit a beat. As for my land, I buried my husband on it, and I aim to be buried on it myself a good long while from now. So you can stop sending your surveyor to look at my lines. I've seen him twice. There won't be a third time, I'm so polite about it. The yard had gone dead silent. No one talked back to Caleb Sterling. It simply wasn't done. Sterling's smile stayed fixed, but something moved behind his eyes. A small, cold recalculation, the look of a man revising a figure in a ledger. He had expected her to wilt. She had not wilted. And a man like Sterling files that away. Spirited, he said pleasantly to the men around him, as if she were a horse. I'll say that for her. He tipped his hat again. Good day, Mrs. Whitaker. Do give my regards to the coyote meat. The laughter came, but it came a half-second late this time, and thinner, and Martha heard the difference even if Sterling didn't. She climbed up onto her wagon seat, gathered the reins, and drove out of that churchyard with her back straight, and she did not let one single tear fall until she was a full mile down the road and certain no living soul could see her. Then she cried hard the way you cry when you've held it too long, and then she wiped her face on her sleeve and set her jaw and said aloud to the empty road, All right then, all right. Chunk. Button lived. He didn't just live, he thrived slow at first, and then not slow at all. Elias's mixture gave way to real feed bought with money Martha didn't have earned by taking in washing and mending, and by selling the eggs she'd meant to eat herself. Young Sam Pike, the blacksmith's boy, 12 years old, and quiet as a held breath, started coming around after his work at his father's forge first, just to look at the famous coyote meat calf, then to help, then because he could not stay away. He follows you, Sam said one evening, wondering as Button trailed at Martha's heel across the pasture like a great black dog. Cattle don't follow a person like that, ma'am. They just don't. This one does, Martha said. I reckon he remembers who came for him when nobody else would. Animals remember that. People forget it mostly. Animals don't. Sam thought about that a while. He was a boy who thought about things. My pa says you're brave, he offered at last. He don't say it where the other men can hear, but he says it. He says it takes a braver kind of person to save something everybody else throwed away than it does to buy something everybody else wants. Martha's throat tightened. Your pa's a good man, Sam. He says Mr. Sterling's scared of you. I heard him tell my ma. He said that man Sterling laughs loudest at the woman he's most afraid of. The boy scratched Button's broad forehead right on the white button mark. Is it true, ma'am? Is he scared of you? Martha looked out across her small green pasture toward the vast dry range beyond her fence, where Sterling's cattle stood in the heat, and the creek that fed them had already this early in the summer begun to shrink. He's scared of what he can't buy, Sam, she said quietly. And so far he can't buy me. That's a new thing for a man like that. New things scare the powerful worse than anything, They spend their whole lives making sure nothing new can ever happen to them. She put her hand on Button's neck, feeling the growing strength in him, the thickening of muscle where 3 months ago there'd been only jutting bone. But new things happen anyhow. They always do. You just got to live long enough to see them. And she watched the shrinking creek across the fence, and she thought about the deepening well she'd started digging with her own blistered hands, and the clay she'd hauled to line a cistern the whole valley would have laughed at her for, and she did not know yet, could not have known how completely the arithmetic of Promise Valley was about to turn itself upside down. But she felt it coming. The way an old wound feels weather. The way a rejected thing feels in its bones the slow turning of the world toward the day it will finally be proven right. She scratched the white button on the black bull's forehead, and the bull leaned his growing weight into her hand, trusting her completely, the way something trusts the one hand in all the world that reached for it when every other hand had let it fall. "They already counted us gone," she told him softly, the words worn smooth now from saying. "Didn't they, Button? You and me both." The bull huffed a warm breath against her palm, and out past the fence, under the white-hot Texas sky, the creek dropped another inch toward the stones. The summer that followed was the summer Promise Valley learned that Martha Whitaker did not scare, and did not quit, and did not forget. It started small the way ruin always does with a thing so slight that only Martha noticed it. She was mending the wire on her east fence one July morning. Button grown now to the size of a yearling steer, and standing patient in her shadow when she found the post pulled loose from its hole. Not broken, not fallen. Pulled. The dirt around it turned and scattered the way dirt does when a rope has been thrown around a post and a horse has been backed against it. She crouched and put her fingers in the loosened earth and went very still. "Somebody did this," she said aloud. Button huffed behind her. "Somebody rode up here in the dark and pulled my post so my fence'd sag and my water'd run where it shouldn't, and then rode off before light." She stood and her hands had gone to fists without her deciding it. "And I know whose man it was. I don't have to see the face. I know the hand behind the hand." She fixed the post. She tamped it deeper than it had been, deep enough that no rope was going to walk it out again, and she sweated through her dress. Doing it in the July heat, and the whole time she talked to herself low and steady, the way she'd learned to, because a woman alone either talks to herself or goes quiet inside, and Martha had decided a long time ago she would not go quiet. That night she moved her bedroll out to the pasture. She lay in the open with her husband's old rifle across her knees, and Button dozing beside her like a black hill. And she watched the fence line until the stars wheeled over, and her eyes burned, and nobody came. Nor the next night, nor the next. On the fourth night they came. She heard the horses before she saw them. 2 of them walking slow and careful along the outside of her fence, and she heard the low murmur of men trying to be quiet and failing at it, and she heard the creak of a saddle as one of them leaned out with a rope. Martha stood up out of the dark. "Evening," she said. The effect was considerable. One horse shied hard and near through its rider. The rope fell slack. 2 men she didn't know, hired range hands by the look, gaped at the sudden shape of a woman standing where no woman should be, at that hour a rifle in her hands catching the starlight. "Now you boys hold real still," Martha said, and she thumbed the hammer back, and the click of it was very loud. "I want you to hear me. I know who sent you. I ain't going to shoot you because you're just doing a hard job for hard wages, and I don't hold that against a working man. But you're going to ride back to Mr. Sterling, and you're going to tell him something for me, word for word. Can you do that?" The nearer man wet his lips. "Yes'm. Tell him Martha Whitaker sleeps in her pasture now. Tell him she's got a rifle and she's got no husband to bury and nothing left to lose, and those are the 3 most dangerous things a person can have all at once." She stepped closer, and Button rose up behind her, huge and black and blowing, and both horses backed away from the size of him. "And tell him the next man who touches my fence in the dark, I'll aim for the leg, and I'll say I couldn't see who it was, and there ain't a soul in that valley will fault a widow for defending her own land at midnight. Now get." They got. She heard of them a long time in the dark, riding faster than they'd come, and when the sound of them was gone, she found she was shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer held-in fury of it, and she sat down hard in the grass, and Button lay down beside her and put his great heavy head across her lap, and she gripped a fistful of his neck and held on. "He'll try something else now," she told the bull. "I called his hand, and a man like that can't stand to have his hand called by a woman. He'll try something worse." She swallowed. "But he showed me something tonight too, Button. He wouldn't be pulling my posts in the dark if my water didn't matter. You don't sneak up on a thing that's worthless." She looked out toward the fence, toward the dark shape of the range beyond, where Sterling's 4,000 head stood in a valley going dry. "He's scared of my little green pasture, and that means my little green pasture's worth being scared of. I just got to live long enough to prove it." Elias said the same thing the next morning when she told him, though he said it with a good deal more cursing in 2 languages. He sent men in the night, to a woman alone. This is what he is now. The old farmer paced her yard stiff-legged with anger. "In the old country, we had a word for a man like this. It does not translate. It means a strong man who is a coward in his strength, who has so much that losing even a little makes him mad, truly mad, like a dog with a bone that snaps at children." He stopped. "You must be careful, Martha, more careful than before. A proud man you can predict. A frightened, proud man does anything. I know it." "Do you? Because I think you enjoy standing up to him a little too much." He fixed her with a hard look. "I understand it. God knows I understand wanting to spit in the eye of the man who thinks he owns the sky. But he can crush you, Martha. He has money and men and the note on your land and the ear of every fool in that town. All you have is one bull that is not even grown, and a well you are digging with your own hands like a madwoman." "And I have the truth," Martha said quietly. "That the water's mine, that I worked for it while they rested, that I saved a thing they threw away." She met his eyes. "Truth's slow, Elias. I know it's slow. But it's got a long memory, and it don't tire out. And I mean to still be standing on the day it finally comes around." Elias looked at her a long moment. Then he shook his head, but there was something like reluctant pride in it. "You," he said, "are going to give me a heart attack before this is finished. Bring me the shovel. If you are going to dig this cistern like a lunatic, I am at least going to show you how to line it so the clay does not crack and waste all your madness." They dug through the worst of the July heat, the two of them, an old man and a widow woman, while Sam Pike hauled clay in a barrow and Button dozed in what shade there was. The town, when it heard of it, laughed anew. A cistern, lining a hole in the ground with clay like a bird building a nest, while every sensible rancher in the valley knew that water came from the creek and the sky, and always had, and any fool waiting on a dry weather store was a fool who'd never seen a Texas summer break, the way they always broke in a good hard rain right about the middle of August, the way God intended. Except the middle of August came and no rain came with it. Martha felt the change in the town before she understood it. She went in for supplies one morning near the end of August, and the mercantile did not laugh at her. That was the first sign. The men who'd made coyote meat jokes all summer stood at the counter with their hats in their hands, and their faces gone tight, and they talked low about the creek, about how far it had dropped, about cattle standing at a mud hole where good water used to run, and when Martha came in, they went quiet, and it was not the quiet of contempt. It was a different quiet. It was the quiet of men who have begun privately to be afraid, and who look at the one person who saw the fear coming and feel ashamed to meet her eye. She bought her flour and her salt. She did not gloat. She had promised herself she would not gloat because Elias had told her 100 times that a wise person never makes an enemy feel small in front of others, since a small-feeling enemy is a dangerous enemy, and Martha had come to believe he was right about most things. But at the door she paused, and she could not quite help herself, and she turned back. "Boys," she said. The men looked up. "That creek's going to keep dropping. It ain't going to break in September neither. Not this year. I feel it in my bones, same as I felt it in June. So you might think on your stock a little sooner than later." She settled her bonnet. "I ain't saying it to crow. I got no pleasure in it. There's cattle out there going to die, and there's men in this room going to be ruined, and I don't wish it on a one of you. I'm just saying, the widow who nursed the coyote meat and dug the crazy hole in the ground turned out to be watching the sky a little closer than the rest of you. That's all. Good day." She left them standing there, and behind her, the mercantile stayed silent, and she knew walking to her wagon that something had shifted in Promise Valley that could never quite shift back. The joke was dying. She could feel it dying. And she felt no triumph in it, only a kind of grim tiredness, because she knew what came after the joke died. What came after was the wanting. It began with the Hollis family, who had the small place south of Elias, 40 acres of nothing, and 11 head of cattle that were all the world to them. Young Tom Hollis came up Martha's road on foot one evening, hat crushed in his hands, and he could barely get the words out for the shame of it. "Mrs. Whitaker, I got no right to ask. After the way folks talked about you all summer, and I'll be honest, ma'am, I laughed some myself and I'm ashamed of it now." He stared at his boots. "My cattle are dying. The creek's mud where we water. My wife's expecting and I got nothing to—" His voice broke. He was maybe 20 years old. "I heard you got green grass yet, and water. And I got no money and no way to pay you and no right at all to be standing here, but I got 11 head that are all we own in this world, and I didn't know where else to go." Martha looked at the boy a long moment. And here was the thing the whole valley would have gotten wrong if the whole valley had been watching. They would have expected her to savor it. To make the boy who'd laughed at her stand and squirm. Sterling would have. Sterling would have wrung every drop of humiliation out of the moment and called it justice. Martha said, "Bring your cattle up in the morning, before the heat." Tom Hollis's head came up. "Ma'am, I can't pay. I didn't ask you to pay. I said bring them up." She paused. "I got a condition, though, and it ain't money. Any cow of yours that Button gets with calf while she's on my grass, I keep every other one of those calves. You keep the rest, I keep every other. That's the deal, and it's a fair one, and you'll thank me for it in 2 years' time, even if you can't see why yet." The boy did not understand. She could see he did not understand. He'd expected to beg for water, and here she was talking about calves 2 years off as if the water were nothing. "Yes'm," he said, baffled and grateful and near weeping. "Yes'm, thank you, I thank you. Go on home to your wife. Bring them at dawn." He went, and Martha stood in her yard in the dying light with Button beside her, and she put her hand on the bull's massive neck, and she said very quietly, so no one but the animal could hear, "You know what you are now, don't you? You ain't coyote meat. You're the best blood in this valley, and don't a soul know it yet, but me and Elias." She scratched the white button on his forehead. 3 years folks laughed at you. 3 years they laughed at me. And now that boy's cattle are going to come stand on my grass and drink my water, and go home, carrying your calves, and in 2 years, those calves are going to be the strongest, calmest, best-doing cattle Promise Valley ever saw, and every man who laughed is going to want one. She smiled, and it was not a soft smile. That's how it turns Button, slow, then all at once. The Hollis cattle came at dawn, and behind them within the week came the Deckers and old Widow Fenn, who had even less than Martha and the Pruitt brothers, who'd been 2 of the loudest laughers at church all summer, and could hardly look at her as they drove their dying stock through her gate. Martha took them all on the same terms every other calf, and she asked no money, and she did not once remind a single one of them how they'd laughed. Elias thought she'd lost her mind again, but for a different reason now. "You are giving away your grass and your water in a drought," he said, "to people who mocked you, to half the valley. Do you understand what you are doing? You are feeding the very town that laughed at you, and taking nothing but the promise of calves not yet born." "I'm taking the calves," Martha said. "That's not nothing, Elias. That's everything. Every one of those poor cows is going home in the fall carrying Button's blood. Every other calf's mine. You do the figuring on that. 3 cows this month, more coming. In 2 years I'll have a herd of Buttons get, and it won't have cost me $1 only grass I'd have grown anyhow and water I stored while they laughed." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not being kind, Elias. Or I am being kind, but I'm being smart too, and there's no law says a person can't be both at once. That's the part Sterling never understood. He thinks you have to choose. Cruel and rich, or kind and poor. He never once imagined a person could be kind and win." Elias stared at her. Then slowly the old farmer began to laugh, a real laugh, deep and helpless, the first true laugh she'd heard from him in a year. "God im Himmel," he wheezed. "You have out-Sterlinged Sterling. You have taken his own game and played it better and made it look like charity." He wiped his eyes. "He is going to hate you, Martha, more than he has ever hated anyone. Because you have found the one thing his money cannot buy and his cruelty cannot take. You have found a way to be loved and to win at the same time." He shook his head, still chuckling. "That poor proud fool. He has no idea what is coming for him." And Caleb Sterling at that moment had no idea, but he was learning fast. He learned it in pieces. He learned it when his own hired men started muttering that the widow Whitaker still had green grass, while the great Sterling Ranch hauled water at $4 a barrel from 20 miles off. He learned it when the poor families he'd never once helped, in 20 years of lording over the valley, began driving their cattle to a woman's gate instead of coming to him hat in hand, the way they always had, the way he liked. He learned it most of all the day the stranger came to town. The stranger was a cattle buyer out of Denver, a spare, quiet man in a good coat named Harlan Reed, and he came to Promise Valley the way buyers come asking after stock, and he heard the talk. Everybody talks to a buyer. And what they talked about that dry August was the strange business of the widow Whitaker and her drought-proof pasture and the black bull she'd raised from a cast-off runt, whose calves folks were starting to notice were coming out bigger and calmer and hardier than any calves had a right to. Harlan Reed rode out to Martha's place unannounced. She met him at the gate with her rifle in the crook of her arm, because she'd learned that summer to meet every stranger armed, and he tipped his hat and told her his business, and asked politely if he might look at the bull. "You can look," Martha said. "Looking's free. Touching costs you a reason." Reed smiled at that. He came into the pasture, and he looked at Button, who was near 2 years old now, and grown into something that made the buyer stop walking and go still. He walked all the way around the bull. He looked at the deep chest, and the straight, strong legs, and the great, calm head with the white button on the forehead. He looked at the way Button stood easy, unbothered, watching him back with a mild, dark, intelligent eye. He ran a hand down the animal's flank, and Button let him, and Reed's face did a thing that Martha would remember the rest of her life. It went from professional courtesy to something close to wonder. "Ma'am," Harlan Reed said slowly, "where did you get this animal?" "Found him in a wash," Martha said. "Half dead, 2 years back. His owner threw him out for a runt and left him for the coyotes, and I carried him home." Reed turned and looked at her as if she'd told him she'd found a diamond in a hog trough. "His owner," Reed said carefully, "threw this out. Called him coyote meat, in front of the whole town, made a fine joke of it and of me both all summer long." Harlan Reed was quiet for a moment. Then he took off his hat, which was not a thing cattle buyers generally did for widow women with dirt under their nails. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "I have bought and sold cattle across 6 states for 30 years, and I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it plain, because I don't think you know it yet, and I think you'd better." He gestured at Button. "That is the finest bull I have seen in a decade. The bone, the temperament, the way he's held condition through a drought that's killing everything around him. Whatever mongrel luck put that blood together, it does not come along twice in a lifetime." He paused. "And whoever threw him away made the worst mistake of his life and doesn't know it yet, and when he finds out, because he will find out, ma'am, I promise you that it is going to about kill him." Martha's heart was pounding, but she kept her face still. "What's a bull like that worth, Mr. Reed?" Reed named a figure. It was more money than Martha Whitaker had seen in her whole life put together. It was more money than she'd see in 10 years of washing and mending and selling eggs she meant to eat herself. It was enough to pay off Sterling's note 3 times over and buy good land and never be poor or afraid or laughed at again. For a long moment, she couldn't breathe. Reed watched her kindly. "You don't have to answer now. A sum like that, a person ought to sit with it. I'll be in town 3 days. You think on it." He put his hat back on. "But I'll tell you, honest ma'am, buyer to seller against my own interest, don't sell him for that. Not for double that. A bull that throws blood like he's throwing, you don't sell that. You build on it. You keep every daughter and you sell the sons, and in 10 years you don't have a bull, you have a bloodline, and a bloodline outlives us all." He tipped his hat again. "The Whitaker line has a ring to it. Good day, ma'am." He rode off, and Martha stood at her gate with the number ringing in her head like a struck bell, and Button came and put his heavy head against her shoulder, and she wrapped her arm around his neck and stood there a long time in the terrible heat. "You hear that?" she whispered. Her voice was not steady now. "You hear what he said, coyote meat?" She laughed, wet and broken. "Finest bull he's seen in 10 years, and Sterling threw you in a ditch." She pressed her face against his neck. "And here's the thing that's going to eat that man alive, Button, when he hears it. He's going to hear the number. Word travels in this valley. He's going to hear a Denver buyer offered the widow he laughed at more money than his whole dying ranch is worth this year for the runt he threw in a wash. And he is not going to be able to stand it." She was right. Of course she was right. Word travels in a valley the way fire travels in dry grass, and by nightfall the number was in every kitchen and bunkhouse and barroom in Promise Valley. And by the next morning it had reached the great house on the Sterling Ranch, where Caleb Sterling sat at his long table over accounts that would not add up no matter how he worked them, and heard from his foreman's mouth what the widow's coyote meat had just been offered. He did not say anything at first. His foreman would tell it later in the bunkhouse quiet. He said Sterling just sat there, went white then red, set down his pen very careful. And then he asked in a voice gone strange and thin for the man to repeat the number. And the man repeated it, and Sterling stared at the wall for so long the foreman thought maybe he ought to fetch somebody. Then Caleb Sterling stood up and put on his good coat and had them saddle his best horse and rode out toward the widow Whitaker's place at a pace that raised dust for a mile behind him, because he had decided in that white and red silence that he was going to buy the bull back, whatever it cost. He had thrown it away, and now it was worth a fortune, and that was intolerable, that a thing he'd discarded should make a poor woman rich, while his own herd died, and his mind could hold only one solution, which was money, because money had solved every problem Caleb Sterling had ever had. He came up her road in a boil of dust and swung down at her gate without being asked, and Martha met him there with the rifle in her arm and Button standing huge and black at her back, and the two of them faced each other across the fence for the first time since the churchyard, the man who'd thrown the calf away and the woman who'd carried it home. "Mrs. Whitaker." He was breathing hard. He made himself slow down. He put on the smile, the churchyard smile, but it fit him poorly now. "I'll come straight to it. I hear you had an offer on the bull, from the Denver man." He named the figure Reed's figure, and it cost him something visible to say it out loud. "I'll better it. I'll pay you that and a quarter more cash today, and I'll tear up the note on your land into the bargain. You'll walk away a rich woman and free and clear. Now that is a fair offer. That is more than fair. That is a fortune, ma'am, for a woman in your position." And there it was. Everything he had laid on the fence rail between them. More money than she'd ever dreamed of. Her land free. Everything the frightened, desperate, drowning part of her had wanted for 3 long years. Martha looked at the bull. She looked at the man. She thought about the wash, and the vultures, and the little pumping ribs, and the word he'd used. Loss. She thought about a night on a dirt floor, with a calf's head in her lap, whispering to it not to make a liar of her. She thought about who reached for a thing when it fell, and who walked away, and how the whole worth of a person might come down to just exactly that. "Mr. Sterling," she said, "you remember what you called him?" Sterling's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Whitaker, coyote meat. You called him coyote meat in front of God and the whole town, and you laughed and they laughed because you're the richest man in the valley, and folks laugh at what you tell them to." She stepped closer to the fence. "You didn't just throw him away, Mr. Sterling. You made a show of it. You used a dying calf to make a small woman feel smaller. That was free to you. Didn't cost you a thing to be cruel that morning, did it? Not one thing. That's business. Ranching's a hard." "It ain't business now, though, is it?" Her voice was very quiet and very level, and it stopped him cold. "Now it's the most expensive thing you ever did in your life. And you rode over here thinking you could buy your way out of it same as you buy your way out of everything, because in your whole life you never once met a thing that money couldn't fix." She let that hang. "Well, you've met one now. He's standing right behind me, and he ain't for sale to you at any price, Mr. Sterling. Not that number, not double, not this whole valley in a sack." She smiled, and it was almost gentle, and that was the cruelest thing about it. You threw him away. You don't get him back. Some things, once you throw them away, you don't ever get them back. I'd think a man your age would have learned that by now. The silence between them was total. Caleb Sterling stood at the fence of the widow he had laughed at all summer, his fortune spread out, and refused his face, working through something no man had ever seen on it before, and buttoned the coyote meat, the runt. The law stood behind Martha Whitaker in the last green pasture in a dying valley, and blew one long slow breath through his nose, and did not move, and did not need to. And when Caleb Sterling finally turned and mounted his horse, he did not say goodbye. He gathered his reins in a white-knuckled fist, and he sat a moment looking down at her, and whatever was in his face, then it was no longer the smooth cold contempt of the churchyard. It was hatred, pure and simple and personal. The hatred of a proud man who has just learned there is one door in the whole world that will not open to his money, and that a woman he'd called a fool is standing in it. "You'll regret this," he said. His voice had gone quiet, too quiet to match hers, and quiet on Caleb. Sterling was a far more frightening thing than loud. "You think you've won something. You've won nothing. You've got one good bull in a valley full of poor folks who'll love you right up until the day it gets hard. And then they'll do what poor folks always do. They'll look for someone to blame." He gathered the horse. "And I'll be there, Mrs. Whitaker, when it gets hard, when that creek's bone dry, and their cattle are dying, and they start to wonder why the widow's got water and they don't. I'll be right there to help them wonder." He touched his hat, and it was an obscene thing that courtesy with what was in his eyes. "Good day, ma'am. Enjoy your bull." He rode off slow, which was worse than fast, and Martha stood at the gate and watched him go, and did not let herself shake until he was small in the distance. Then she turned to Button, and put both arms around his great neck, and pressed her face into him. "He's going to come for us now," she said, and her voice was not steady at all. "Not in the dark with 2 hired men and a rope. He's done with that. He's going to come in the daylight with the whole town behind him, and he's going to make them believe that me having water is the reason they're dying." She held on tight. "And the terrible thing, Button, the truly terrible thing, is that he's smart enough to do it. A frightened, proud man does anything Elias said. And I just made him the most frightened, proud man in Texas." She stood there in the killing heat with her arms around the bull that could not be bought in the last green place in a valley turning to bone, and out past her fence the creek that fed 4,000 head of Sterling's cattle. Finally that very afternoon ran down to a thread, and then to a string of drying pools, and then to nothing at all but hot stones and the tracks of desperate animals that had come to drink and found only dust. The drought had teeth now, and Caleb Sterling had a plan. And Martha Whitaker had a bull and a promise, and a valley full of people who loved her exactly as much as their thirst would let them. Caleb Sterling did not come the next day nor the next week, and that was the worst of it. Martha had braced herself for a storm, and instead got silence, and silence from a man like Sterling was not peace. It was the sound of a trap being built somewhere out of sight. She heard the first nail go in through Sam Pike. The boy came up her road at a dead run one evening. His shirt soaked through, and he was talking before he reached the gate. "Mrs. Whitaker. Mrs. Whitaker, my pa says you got to hear it from me before you hear it in town." Martha set down the bucket she was carrying. "Slow down. Breathe. Now tell it. Mr. Sterling called a meeting at the church, all the cattlemen, and he stood up in front of everybody and he said—" Sam swallowed, his young face twisted with the wrongness of what he was about to repeat. "He said the reason the whole valley's dying is that the water's being hoarded. He said there's one selfish person sitting on the last green grass and the last good water while good families watch their cattle die. He didn't say your name, ma'am. He didn't have to. Everybody knew. And he said it real sorrowful, like it grieved him, like he was just heartbroke to have to bring it up." Martha went very still. "He said—" Sam went on miserable, That in a Christian valley in a time of trial, no one person's got a right to more than their neighbors. He said, water's like air. It belongs to everybody. And a person who fences it off and lets folks go thirsty is, he said it plain, ma'am. He said that's a kind of murder. He used that word, murder. The word landed in Martha's chest like a stone dropped down her well. And folks listened. Some did. Sam's chin trembled. Not all. My pa stood up and said it wasn't right that you'd saved half their herds already, that you took the Hollis cattle and the Fen cattle and never asked a dime. And some men nodded. But then Sterling, he's smart. Mrs. Whitaker, he's so smart, it's scary. He said of course she took them in and made them beholden, and now she owns half the calves in the valley. He turned your kindness into a trick. He made it sound like you'd been buying folks up cheap all along, waiting for the drought, like a spider. The boy was crying now, angry tears. And I watched men who ate at their neighbor's expense all summer start to nod. Like they wanted to believe it. Like it was easier to be mad at you than to be scared of dying. Martha put her hand on the boy's shoulder. Her mind was moving fast and cold. That's the most dangerous thing there is, Sam, she said quietly. A lie that lets a frightened man off the hook. He handed them away to blame somebody besides themselves and the sky, and they grabbed it because blame's easier to swallow than fear. She looked out toward the range. He didn't just tell them I'm hoarding water. He told them it's my fault their cattle are dying. And a man will do things to the person he blames for his dying cattle that he'd never do to a neighbor down on her luck. What are you going to do? I don't know yet. She meant it. But I know one thing. I'm not going to stop giving water to anybody who comes to my gate for it. Household water, drinking water. Anybody thirsty. Anybody's children, they come and they get it, and they always have, and Sterling knows it, which is why he never once said, I turned a soul away. Because I never did. Her jaw set. He's not fighting the truth, Sam. He can't. The truth is, I've shared everything I could share. He's fighting the story. And right now he's telling it better than I am. She was right to be afraid. Because Sterling wasn't finished telling it. The next blow came from a direction she hadn't guarded. Old Widow Fen, who had brought her 3 starving cows to Martha's grass in August, and wept with gratitude. Widow Fen stopped Martha outside the mercantile a week later, and her old face was closed and cold, and she would not quite meet Martha's eye. Martha, I'll be taking my cows back to my own place. Ada, your place is dust. They'll die inside a month. That's my worry, not yours. The old woman's mouth worked. Folks are saying you took us in so's you could take our calves, that you're building a herd off our misfortune. That when this is over, you'll be rich and we'll have signed it all away to you in the bad time when we didn't know better. Martha felt the ground shift under her. Ada, look at me. Did I ever once ask you for a thing but every other calf? Did I hide the terms? Did I make you sign anything you didn't understand? No. The old woman's voice dropped. No, you didn't. And that's the truth, and I know it's the truth. Her eyes came up at last, and they were wet and ashamed. But Martha, everybody's saying it. And when everybody's saying a thing, standing against it makes you a target too. I'm an old woman alone. I can't afford to be your friend right now. God forgive me, but I can't. She turned away. I'll send my grandson for the cows. And she went, and Martha stood on the boardwalk and understood fully for the first time exactly what Sterling had done. He hadn't come for her with men and ropes. He'd come for her friends. He'd made it dangerous to be seen on her side. He was hollowing her out from the edges, one frightened neighbor at a time, so that when the day came, he could point at her and say, Look, even the folks she helped have turned from her. That tells you what kind of woman she is. Elias saw it too, and for the first time since she'd known him, the old man looked truly frightened. This is what I warned you, he said, pacing her yard that night. A frightened, proud man does anything. But this is worse than anything I imagined. He is not attacking you. He is poisoning the well of you. He is making the whole valley believe that kindness was a trick. He stopped and gripped the fence rail. And the terrible part, Martha, the part that will keep me awake, is that it is working. I heard 2 men today, good men whose cattle you saved, saying maybe there was something to it. Maybe the widow was too clever. Maybe. I know. Do you have a plan? Martha was quiet a long moment. Button stood beside her in the dark, and she rested her hand on his neck, the way she always did when she needed to think. I've got the truth, Elias. It's all I've ever had. She spoke slowly. But you taught me the truth slow, and a lies fast, and right now his lies got a head start on my truth by a mile. So I can't just wait. I've got to do something that makes the truth impossible to argue with. Something even Sterling can't twist. She turned to him. I've been thinking on it. What if I called the meeting not him? Me? What if I stood up in that church in front of every one of them and laid it all bare? The terms, the calves, the water. What if I offered them something so fair that turning it down would show the whole valley who the real spider is? Elias stared at her. You would walk into that church, where he has already turned them against you, and stand alone in front of 100 frightened, angry people. Where else does the truth get told, Elias? In the dark, in whispers like his lies. She shook her head. No. If I'm going to lose this, I'll lose it in the light, standing up saying my piece. But I don't think I'll lose, because there's one thing he can't answer, and if I can just make them sit still long enough to hear it. She never finished the thought because that was the night it went from a war of words to a war. It started with smoke. Sam Pike smelled it. First he'd taken to sleeping in Martha's barn some nights, with his pa's blessing, to help her watch the place, and he came pounding on her cabin door in the black hour before dawn, screaming that the west field was afire. Martha was out the door in her nightdress, with a bucket in each hand before she was fully awake, and what she saw stopped her heart. Someone had set fire to her hay. The whole winter's store of it, the feed she'd cut and cured and stacked all through the brutal summer, while the town laughed the feed that was keeping her own stock, and half the valley's borrowed cattle alive. It was a wall of flame, and beyond it, riding away fast in the dark, she saw the shapes of 2 horsemen. The cistern, she screamed at Sam. Buckets from the cistern. Wet the grass line or it jumps the fence. They fought it. A woman, a 12-year-old boy, and a bull that would not leave Martha's side even with fire in front of him. They fought that blaze bucket by bucket in the dark, and Elias came at a run from his own place, having seen the glow, and Tom Hollis came. And Old Fenn's grandson came, some of the very people Sterling had turned. They came anyway, when they saw the fire, because there is a thing deeper in people than the stories they've been told. And a neighbor's fire in the night reaches down and touches it. They saved the pasture. They did not save the hay. When the sun came up, Martha Whitaker stood in front of a smoking black ruin that had been a winter's survival. Her face and hands and nightdress gray with ash, and she did not cry, and she did not rage, and that stillness frightened Elias more than screaming would have. Martha, he said gently, he burned my feed. Her voice was flat and strange. In a drought, with half the valley's cattle depending on it. He didn't just come for me, Elias. He burned the feed, keeping the Hollis cattle alive, the Decker cattle. He'll say it was an accident, or he'll say I did it myself for sympathy, or he'll say nothing at all and let folks wonder. She turned, and her eyes in her ash-gray face were terrible. But he's made a mistake, his first real one, because those horsemen rode off toward the Sterling Road, and Tom Hollis saw them, and Fenn's boy saw them, and Sam saw them, and they're not going to unsee it just because Sterling tells them to. But Sterling was cleverer than that. By noon, the story in town was already turning the widow's hay had caught from her own cook-fire careless woman, or maybe some were whispering. Maybe she'd fired it herself to play the victim to turn folks back to her side now that opinion had shifted. He had an answer for everything. He always had an answer. And that was when Martha understood she could not win this with words alone, or even with the truth alone. Sterling had built a machine that turned every fact into its opposite. Kindness became trickery. Arson became her own carelessness. The more she was wronged, the guiltier he made her look. There was only one thing left he could not twist. One thing that could not be turned into a story. And she saw it standing in the ashes, and it was a desperate thing, and it might cost her everything, but it was all she had left. Sam, she said, can your pa get word to that Denver buyer Harlan Reed? Is he still in the territory? I think so, ma'am. Pa heard he was buying up north a few days' ride. Why? Because I need a witness this valley can't call a liar. Somebody who owes Sterling nothing and me nothing. A stranger with a good name who can stand up and say a true thing in front of everybody. She wiped ash from her face with the back of her wrist. Send for him. Tell him Martha Whitaker's calling in a favor she never asked for. Tell him the bull he admired is in trouble, and the woman who raised it needs the truth spoke by a mouth this town can't call crooked. Sam ran, and Martha called her meeting. She had it posted in town plain and public that Martha Whitaker would speak at the church on Sunday, next on the matter of the valley's water, and that all were welcome, and that she would answer any question any man cared to put to her in the open before God and everybody. It was Elias told her, either the bravest thing he'd ever seen or the most foolish, and he honestly could not tell which, and neither could she. The days between were the longest of her life. The threats came steady now, a dead rattlesnake on her fence post, her remaining water trough found fouled with a dead coyote one morning, and she hauled it out and scrubbed the trough and refilled it and said nothing. Twice men rode past her place, slow-looking, not stopping. She stopped sleeping in the cabin and slept in the pasture again, rifle across her knees. Button, a warm black wall at her back. Sam in the barn. Elias's old dog he'd loaned her lying watchful in the yard. "Why don't you run?" Sam asked her one of those nights, small and scared in the dark. "You could sell Button to the Denver man for all that money and go somewhere they don't hate you. You could be rich and safe. Why stay and let 'em do all this to you?" Martha was quiet a while. The stars turned overhead. "Sam, when I found Button in that wash half dead, do you know what the sensible thing was? Leave him. Leave him. Every number said leave him. Sterling left him. The whole valley would have left him. Leaving him was the smart, safe, sensible thing, and I couldn't do it. Not because I'm brave, because I'd been left myself and I knew what it was, and I couldn't be the one doing it to something else." She was quiet again. "If I run now, I'm leaving something in that wash. I'm leaving every poor family that stood at my gate. I'm leaving the truth lying there half dead for the coyotes because it got hard to carry. And I can't. It's the same thing, Sam. It was always the same thing. You don't walk past. Once you've decided who you are, you don't get to walk past." Sam didn't say anything, but he moved a little closer in the dark, and after a while, his breathing went slow and even, and Martha watched over the boy and the bull and her burned-down winter's feed until the sun came up. Sunday came. The church was fuller than Martha had ever seen it. They came from every corner of the valley, the poor families and the proud ones, the men whose cattle she'd saved, and the men who'd laughed loudest, and they packed the pews and stood along the walls and crowded the doorway, and the air inside was thick with heat and sweat, and the particular ugly electricity of a crowd that has been told who to blame and has half decided to believe it. Caleb Sterling sat in the front pew. Of course he did. In his good coat, calm and grave and sorrowful, the very picture of a leading citizen come to see justice done. And when Martha walked up that center aisle alone, no husband, no family, no rifle. She'd left the rifle home on purpose. She felt every eye in that room turn on her, and she felt the weight of the story he'd built pressing down on her from all sides, and she had never in her life been so afraid. Button was not with her. You cannot bring a bull into a church. She had left him in the pasture, and she felt the lack of him at her back like a missing limb, and she made herself walk anyhow up to the front and turn and face them all. "Most of you know me," she began, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "And most of you have heard this last while that I'm the reason your cattle are dying, that I'm sitting on water I won't share, that I took your neighbor's stock onto my grass so I could steal their calves out from under them in the bad time." She paused. "I called this meeting to answer that, every bit of it, in the open. So ask me, any man here, ask me anything, and I'll answer true, and then you can judge for yourselves." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Sterling rose slow and grave and turned so the whole room could see him. "Mrs. Whitaker." His voice was gentle, so gentle, dripping with false regret. "No one wants to accuse a widow. God knows I don't. But the valley is dying, ma'am, and you have water and green grass when your neighbors have dust, and you've taken a dozen families' cattle onto your land under terms that give you their calves. I'll ask it plain since you ask to be asked." He spread his hands, sorrowful, reasonable. "Is it right in a time of dying for one person to grow rich off the desperation of her neighbors? Is that Christian? Is that neighborly? That's all any of us wants to know." It was masterful. Martha saw it land. She saw heads turn to her, saw the crowd lean in, saw 100 frightened people waiting to have their fear made righteous. And Martha Whitaker took a breath and gave the answer she'd been building toward for 3 years. "No," she said. The room stilled. Sterling blinked. It was not what he'd braced for. "No, it wouldn't be right," Martha went on, "for one person to grow rich off her neighbor's desperation. Mr. Sterling's dead right about that. So let's talk about who's done it." She turned from Sterling to the crowd. "Tom Hollis, stand up, son. Don't be shy. Tell these folks when you brought me your 11 dying cattle in August, what did I charge you?" Tom Hollis rose red-faced. "Nothing, ma'am. You never charged me a dime." "What were the terms?" "Every other calf your bull sired. You keep half, I keep half. And you told me plain I'd thank you for it in 2 years, even if I couldn't see why." "Did I hide anything trick you make you sign in the dark?" "No, ma'am. You said it right out in your own yard and let me think on it and told me to go home to my wife." "Sit down, Tom. Thank you." She swept the room. "Now, is there one soul in this church I turned away thirsty? One child I refused water? One family I sent off dry? If there is, stand up now and name it, and I'll own it before God and everybody." She waited. The silence stretched. No one stood. "Nobody, because I never once did it. Household water, drinking water, anybody thirsty. My gate's been open all summer, and it's open right now, and it'll be open tomorrow, and Mr. Sterling knows it. Which is why, for all his sorrowful talk, he's never once, not one time, said, 'I refused a person a drink.'" She let that sink deep. He can't say it, because it isn't true. And the man's built his whole case on a thing he knows isn't true. Sterling's face had begun to change, just slightly, a tightness at the jaw. "Now here's the question nobody's asked," Martha said, and her voice dropped, and the whole room leaned to catch it. "Why do I have water? Why is my grass green when yours is dust? Sterling wants you to think it's luck or theft or some spider's trick. So let me tell you the truth of it, and every man here knows in his heart it's true, because you all watched me do it, and you all laughed while I did." She looked from face to face. "I dug my well deeper while you rested. I lined a cistern with clay by hand in the July heat while you called me a madwoman. I stored feed all summer while you told me the rain would come in August like it always does. I watched the sky and I believed what it told me, and I worked when working was miserable and unpopular and folks made jokes about the crazy widow." Her voice rose now steady and hard and ringing. "You want to know why I've got water? Because I'm the only person in this valley who acted like the drought was real before it killed anybody. That's not luck. That's not theft. That's labor. That's a whole summer of labor you all watched me do and laughed at, and now that it saved my land, you want to call it a crime." The room had gone utterly silent. She had them. She could feel that she had them. And Sterling, who was never a fool, felt it too, and played his last card. "Fine words," he said, cutting across her loud, now the sorrow gone. "Fine, fine words. But words don't water cattle, Mrs. Whitaker. My herds are dying while you make speeches. Every man here is losing everything he owns while you stand up there and preach about your clever hard work. And I say the time for pretty speeches is done." He turned to the crowd and his voice rose to fill the church. "She's got water. We need it. Our families are dying. And I say, no woman's fence and no woman's speech stands between dying men and water in a Christian valley. I say, we ride out there today right now and we open that gate and we water this valley's cattle, whether the widow likes it or not." It was the thing he'd been building to all along. Martha understood it in a flash of cold clarity. The meeting, the poison, the burned hay, all of it he'd been herding them to this exact moment, A mob in a hot church whipped up to ride on her gate, and if they broke it open and took her water by force, then her land was worthless, and her stand was broken, and he'd have won, and he'd have done it wearing the mask of a man helping his neighbors. And half the room came to its feet with a roar. Not all, but half. Frightened, desperate, grief-stricken men who'd lost their cattle and their savings, and wanted more than anything in the world someone to fight something to do somewhere, to put the terror of watching their whole lives dry up and blow away. They surged up, and Sterling stood in the middle of them like the eye of a storm, and Martha stood alone at the front, and for one terrible moment she thought it was over. Then a voice cut through the noise. A stranger's voice, dry and calm and carrying from the back of the church by the door. "I'd think hard, gentlemen, before I rode on that woman's gate." Every head turned. Harlan Reed stood in the doorway, dusty from days of hard riding. Sam Pike, white-faced at his side, and the cattle buyer took off his hat and came slow up the aisle, while the crowd throne went quiet to hear him. "Some of you know my name, Harlan Reed. I buy cattle out of Denver, 30 years at it, and I've got no stake in this valley and no love for anybody in it, which means I've got no reason to lie to a single one of you." He reached the front and turned to face them. "I came through here in August. Heard about a widow with a black bull raised up from a runt. Rode out to see it expecting nothing. And I want to tell you what I told her that day." He looked around the room. "That bull is the finest piece of blood I've seen in 10 years buying. And I offered her a sum for it that'd make every man in this room dizzy to hear. And you know what she did? He let it hang. Nobody breathed. She turned me down. Wouldn't sell. And then, gentlemen, this same man—" He pointed a blunt finger straight at Caleb Sterling. "This same man who's standing up here today calling her a hoarder and a spider rode to her gate and offered her more than I did cash, plus her land free and clear to buy that bull back. Because it's his. He owned it. He threw it in a wash to die 2 years ago and called it coyote meat in front of this whole town, and now that a poor woman's proved what it's worth, he'd give a fortune to own it again, and he can't stand that he can't." Reed's dry voice turned to iron. "That's the man asking you to ride on her gate, not to save your cattle, to break the one person who bested him. You want to be his hired hands in that. You want to do his burning for him in the daylight, since his men botched it in the dark." The word burning went through the crowd like a current. Heads turned. Tom Hollis was on his feet. Fenn's grandson was on his feet. Sam Pike, small and shaking and furious, stepped out into the aisle beside Reed. "I saw them," the boy cried, his voice cracking. "The night the hay burned, 2 riders going toward the Sterling Road, I saw 'em, and so did Tom, and so did—" "The boy's lying?" Sterling snapped too fast, too loud, and it was the first wrong note he'd struck all day, and the whole room heard it. A man in command does not snap. A man with nothing to hide does not go pale when a child names the direction his riders fled. And in that snap, in that paleness, the story he'd spent weeks building began all at once to come apart. Martha saw it happen. She saw the crowd's fury turn in the air like a weather vane in a shifting wind, saw it swing off of her and hang uncertain and just begin to turn toward the man in the front pew. And she knew that this was the moment, the hinge of the whole thing, and that what she said in the next breath would decide whether Promise Valley rode on her gate or turned forever against the man who'd sent them. She stepped down from the front. She walked into the middle of them, small and ash-marked and unarmed, into the middle of the mob that had risen to break her, and she did the one thing Caleb Sterling in his whole life had never once thought to do. She didn't accuse him. She didn't shame him. She gave them a way out that let every frightened man in that room keep his dignity. "I'm not going to stand here and call any of you my enemy," she said, turning slow so she faced them all. "You're scared. Your cattle are dying and your children are watching, and a scared man'll believe near anything that gives him someone to blame. I don't hold it against you. God is my witness, I don't." Her voice gentled and yet carried to every corner. "So, I'm not going to make you choose between your pride and your neighbors. I'm going to offer you a thing instead. And then you can ride on my gate if you still want to, and I won't have a rifle to stop you. Or you can take what I'm offering. Your choice. Free men choosing in the open. The church was so quiet now she could hear the wind outside. "Here it is," Martha said. "My gate stays open for water, same as it's been all summer. Any family, anytime buckets for your homes and your children, and that has never once cost a dime and never will. And for your cattle." She took a breath. "Any man here who's losing his herd can do what the Hollis family did. Bring your cows to my grass. Every other calf out of my bull is yours to keep to build back with drought-strong blood that'll carry your family through the next dry year and the one after that. Not charity. A fair trade made in the open that leaves you standing on your own 2 feet with something better than you had before." She turned at last and looked at Caleb Sterling, and her voice did not rise. "That's what I'm offering. Everything I've got shared fair, so this valley comes through the drought stronger than it went in." A pause. "Now, Mr. Sterling offered to buy my bull for a fortune so he could own it alone. I'm offering to share its blood with every family that needs it. So I'll let you all decide right here which one of us is the spider." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And then Sam Pike's father, the blacksmith, a big quiet man who'd said almost nothing through the whole terrible summer, rose up from his pew in the middle of the church. He took off his hat. He held it against his chest. And in the ringing silence, he said in a voice rough with shame, "We was wrong about you, ma'am. I was wrong about you." He turned and looked at the crowd, hat in hand. "And I'm done being wrong. My family's cattle are going to Mrs. Whitaker's grass in the morning, and I'll shoe the horse of any man here who wants to ride against her. I'll shoe it, and then I'll stand at her gate beside her, and he'll have to come through me first." He put his hat back on and sat down, and one by one, in the hot, crowded church, the men of Promise Valley began to take their hats off too. The hats came off across the church like wheat going down before a scythe, and Caleb Sterling watched his valley change hands from the front pew, and for the first time in 20 years, the richest man in Promise Valley did not know what to do. He stood up into the silence. He had to do something, and standing was all his body knew. "You're all fools," he said, and his voice cracked on it, and the crack was worse than the words. "Every one of you. She's got you eating out of her hand with pretty talk about calves and sharing, and you'll all come crawling to me by winter when her charity runs dry, see if you don't." "Sit down, Caleb." It was the blacksmith. He didn't rise. He didn't raise his voice. He just said it flat and heavy, and something in the way he said it, the way a man says a thing, he has finally permanently decided made Sterling stop. "You burned that woman's winter feed?" The blacksmith went on. Still quiet, still not looking up. "My boy saw your riders. Tom Hollis saw 'em. Fenn's grandson saw 'em. And you stood up in the house of God this morning and called a widow a murderer for having the water you tried to take by fire in the night." He lifted his head at last. "I shod your horses for 11 years, Caleb. I'll not shoe 'em again. Now sit down or get out. But you're done telling this valley who to hate." Sterling looked around the room for an ally. That was the moment Martha would remember longest, not his cruelty, but that small, desperate turning of his head, a powerful man looking for one friendly face and finding none. The men he'd led for 20 years looked at their boots. The men whose notes he held looked at the wall. And the poor families he'd never once helped looked straight at him, and there was no fear left in their faces, only a cold, clear reckoning. He got out. He walked up the aisle alone, and the crowd parted from him. The way it had parted for Reed, only this parting was different. This was the way people pull back from something they no longer want to touch. And he went out the church door into the white heat, and his boots were loud on the steps, and then he was gone. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then the whole church seemed to let out a breath at once and turned as one to Martha. She stood at the front with her ash-marked hands and her plain dress, and she did not feel like she'd won anything. She felt hollowed out and shaking. But she made herself speak, because she'd learned that the moment after a victory is more dangerous than the moment before, and a valley full of ashamed, relieved, grateful people can turn as fast as a frightened one if nobody gives them something to do with all that feeling. "All right," she said. "All right, then let's not waste the morning. Any man who wants to bring his cattle to my grass, come see me after, and we'll shake on the terms plain and open in front of witnesses, so there's never a question. Any family that needs household water, my gate's open today, same as it was yesterday. And her voice caught and she steadied it. And I want to thank the man who rode 3 days on my word alone to speak a true thing to strangers. Mr. Reed, I got no way to pay you back. Harlan Reed settled his hat. You paid me back the day you refused to sell that bull, ma'am. A person who won't sell the best thing they own to the man who'd misuse it. He almost smiled. That's a person worth riding 3 days for. Don't thank me. Just build that bloodline like I told you. That's thanks enough. He nodded to the room. Gentlemen, I'll be buying strong drought blood cattle out of this valley in a few years' time if a certain widow's got any sense, and something tells me she has. Good day to you all. He went, and the church broke up into 100 low conversations, and men came to Martha one after another, hats in hands, and shook on the terms, and some of them tried to apologize and couldn't find the words, and she let them off easy, and some of them just gripped her hand hard and looked at her and said nothing, which was its own kind of apology, and maybe the truest kind. But it was not over. Martha knew it was not over. A cornered man is most dangerous the moment after you corner him. And she had just cornered Caleb Sterling in front of the whole valley, and taken his people and his story, and his standing all in one morning. And a man like that does not go home and make peace with it. She knew it, walking out of that church into the killing heat. She knew it the way she'd known the drought was coming when the town still laughed. Some part of her had already started listening for the sound of his next move. It came 3 days later, and it did not come the way she expected, and that was what nearly finished her. She'd braced for fire again, or men in the night, or a snake on the post. She had not braced for the law. A rider came up her road mid-morning in a good coat. A stranger, and behind him at a distance came Sterling himself, on his black horse hanging back watching, and Martha's stomach dropped even before the stranger reached her gate, and produced a folded paper, and said the words she'd been dreading in some deep place for 3 years, without ever quite letting herself hear them. Mrs. Martha Whitaker, I'm serving notice, ma'am. This here's a demand for full payment on the mortgage note against this property held by Mr. Caleb Sterling principal, and all back interest due and payable in 30 days' time. Fail to pay in full, the property's forfeit, and you're to vacate. He held out the paper. She didn't take it, so he set it on the fence post. It's all legal, ma'am. Signed and filed at the county seat. I'm sorry to bring it. Martha stared at the paper on the post. Behind the server, far back on the road, Caleb Sterling sat his horse and watched, and even at that distance, she could feel him smiling. He'd found the one thing she couldn't fight with the truth. He'd found the one weapon that didn't care whether the valley loved her or hated her, whether she'd shared her water or hoarded it, whether she was a spider or a saint. The note. The old note he'd bought up quiet the winter Daniel died when she was too grief-blind to fight it. He'd held it 3 years like a card in his sleeve, and now beaten in the open he'd played it. How much? She made herself ask. The full sum. All of it. The server named the figure. It was not the Denver figure. It was not a fortune. It was in fact a fairly modest sum by the standards of ranching. But it was 3 years of a poor widow's whole earnings. It was more cash money than Martha Whitaker had ever held or ever would, and she had 30 days to produce it, or lose the land she'd buried her husband on the grass that was keeping half the valley alive, the pasture where a bull named Button had learned to stand. And Sterling knew she didn't have it. That was the whole cruel genius of it. He didn't need the valley on his side anymore. He didn't need them to ride her gate. He just needed 30 days and a piece of paper and the plain fact that a woman who'd given away every spare dollar keeping other folks' cattle alive had nothing left in the box under her bed. She could sell Button. That was the trap's teeth showing. She could sell the bull to Reed for 10 times the note and pay it off and be rich and safe. But the moment she sold, Button the bloodline scattered, the calves stopped, every family that had just shaken her hand, lost the future she'd promised them, and she became exactly the woman Sterling had said she was, someone who'd used them and cashed out. Or she could keep the bull and lose the land, and then the bull had no grass, and it all came to the same ruin by a different road. He'd built a box with no door. Sell the bull and betray the valley, or keep the bull and lose the land. Either way, Caleb Sterling won. Martha took the paper off the post. She read it twice slow, and her hands were steady, and she was proud of that later, that her hands didn't shake in front of Sterling's man. "Tell Mr. Sterling I got his message," she said. "Tell him I said 30 days is 30 days, and I'll see him on the last one." The server touched his hat and rode off, and Sterling turned his black horse and went with him, and he never once came close, never said a word, just showed himself so she'd know whose hand it was. And that silence was the most frightening thing he'd ever done. Elias found her sitting on her porch step, an hour later with the paper in her lap, and when she told him the sum and the terms, the old man sat down hard beside her like his legs had gone. 30 days, he said. 30 days. You do not have it. No. You have grass and a bull and a valley full of people who love you, and not one of them has $30 to spare, let alone. He named the figure again, disbelieving. The families you saved are the poorest in the county. That is why he chose them to turn against you, and it is why they cannot save you now. He has thought of everything, Martha. He always thinks of everything. Elias put his face in his gnarled hands. You must sell the bull. I hate to say it. I would cut off my own hand before I said it. But you must sell the bull, pay the note, and keep your land. It is the only... And what happens to the Hollis calf coming in spring, and the Decker cows I've got in calf right now? And every family I stood up in that church and promised. Martha shook her head slowly. The minute I sell Button Elias, I'm the woman Sterling said I was. I used them, and I cashed out, and I left them holding nothing. Their cows go home empty. The Whitaker line dies before it's born. And every man who took his hat off to me in that church learns that taking your hat off to Martha Whitaker was a fool's move after all. She looked at him. He didn't just build a trap to take my land. He built one to take my name too. If I sell Button to save myself, I prove him right about everything. Elias had no answer. For the first time in the whole long fight, the old man had no answer at all, and that silence sat between them on the porch step worse than any words. The news went through the valley by nightfall, the way news always did. And here was the thing Sterling had not counted on, the one variable in all his careful figuring that he'd gotten wrong. He had built his trap, assuming the poor stayed poor and the beaten stayed beaten, and folks looked out for themselves in the end. He had spent his whole life being right about that. It was the bedrock under everything he believed. He was about to learn he'd been wrong. It started with Tom Hollis, who had 11 cattle and a wife 8 months along and not $2 to rub together. He came up Martha's road the morning after the news broke on foot, as always, and he stood at her gate, turning his hat in his hands, and he said, "Mrs. Whitaker, I brung you something, and I'll be ashamed my whole life it's so little." He held out 4 silver dollars. It was Martha understood at once every cent the Hollis family had in the world. "Tom? No, I can't take that. Your wife, the baby coming. You took my dying cattle when I had no right to ask, and no way to pay," the boy said, and his voice was fierce and shaking. "You never once made me feel small for it. My cows are carrying your bull's calves right now, and come spring, my family's got a future we didn't have because of you. So you'll take the $4, ma'am, and you'll not argue because it ain't charity. It's what's owed. And I'm going house to house today, every family you saved, and we're going to see how close $4 at a time gets you to that note." And he went. And that was the twist Caleb Sterling never saw coming, because he had never in his life understood it, that a person who gives without keeping accounts creates a debt deeper than any note, a debt of the heart that a whole valley will bankrupt itself to pay. They came all day, and the next day, and the day after. Fenn's grandson brought a jar of coins the old woman had been saving for her burial, and old widow Fenn came behind him. The same woman who'd taken her cows back in shame, and she stood at Martha's gate and wept, and said, "I turned from you when it got dangerous, Martha, and there's no forgiving that. But you'll take my burial money anyhow, because I'd sooner go in the ground in a plain box knowing I helped you than in a fine one knowing I didn't." The Decker family brought what they had. The Pruitt brothers, who'd laughed loudest at church all summer, brought a month's wages and couldn't meet her eye. The blacksmith brought the contents of his cash box and said his family would eat lean till spring and be glad to. Sam Pike brought $7 he'd saved 2 years for a rifle of his own, and when Martha tried to refuse it, the boy set his jaw exactly the way she set hers, and said, "You told me you don't walk past." "Well, I ain't walking past neither. I learned it off you." And she had to turn away, so the boy wouldn't see her face. But it was not enough. That was the cruel arithmetic Sterling had counted on, and that even a valley's love could not quite overturn. Poor families giving everything still added up to poor families. And when Elias sat down with Martha at the end of the 3rd week and counted the jar and the coins and the crumpled bills spread across her table, the total for all the tears and sacrifice in it came to less than half the note. "Less than half," Elias said heavily. "With 8 days left. Martha, they have given you their burial money and their children's rifle money and their bread money, and it is not enough, and there is no more to give. The valley is squeezed dry." He rubbed his eyes. He knew to the dollar what they could raise, and he set the sum above it. "He has beaten us with our own goodness. He turned even their love into a thing that is not enough." Martha looked at the money on the table, at all that love counted out in coins, and she felt something in her that was worse than despair. She felt the temptation. Because Button stood out in the pasture, and Button was worth 10 of that note, and one word to Harlan Reed would end. It would pay every debt and save the land, and the money on the table could go back to the burial jars and the children's savings where it belonged. One word, and it was reasonable. It was maybe even right. Was it fair to let Tom Hollis's family eat lean, let Fen go to a pauper's grave when the bull in her pasture could fix it all with a signature? She sat with that temptation late into the night alone, the way she'd sat with the dying calf 3 years before. And it was Button himself who decided it in the end, though he never knew he did. She went out to the pasture in the black hours because she couldn't sleep, and the bull came to her in the dark, the way he always had, and put his great head against her chest. And she stood there with her arms around the neck of the thing everyone had told her to let die. And she understood finally and completely that she could not sell him. Not because of the money, or the bloodline, or even the promise. Because selling Button to save herself would be walking past. It would be looking at the dying calf in the wash and doing the sensible thing. And she had decided 3 years ago, in a dry creek bed with the vultures circling, who she was going to be. You don't get to undecide that when it gets hard. That's the whole point of deciding it. "I'm not selling you," she whispered into his warm neck. "I don't know how I'm going to save us, but I'm not doing it by throwing you away. If we go down together, same as we came up." The bull huffed against her trusting, and she held on. "There's got to be another road. There's always another road. I just can't see it yet." And in the morning she found it. Or rather, it found her riding up her road in a good coat dusty from the trail Harlan Reed back in the valley, and Martha's heart clenched because she thought he'd come to buy the bull. Come to make the offer she'd just sworn in the dark she wouldn't take. But Reed didn't dismount at her gate. He leaned on his saddle horn and looked down at her and said, "Word reached me up north that Caleb Sterling called that note. 30 days. He said it flat. That true. 8 days left now. And you won't sell me the bull to pay it. Sam Pike's letter said you swore you wouldn't even to save the land. Said you'd sooner lose everything than break faith with the folks you promised." Reed studied her a long moment. "That true too?" "It's true." The cattle buyer was quiet. Then he did something Martha didn't understand at first. He swung down off his horse and he came to her gate and he took off his hat. "Mrs. Whitaker, I've bought cattle 30 years, and I've met maybe 3 people in all that time I'd trust with money on nothing but their word. You're the 4th. He reached into his coat. "I'm not going to buy your bull. You've made it plain that bull's not for sale, and I've come to respect why. So here's what I'll do instead, and it's business, not charity, so don't you dare refuse it out of pride." He drew out a folded document. "I'll pay off Sterling's note. In full, today. And in return, you'll sign me a contract for first right to buy the bull calves out of the Whitaker line. Not the heifers, you keep every heifer, That's the bloodline, and it stays yours, just the bull calves at fair market price for 10 years. I get a steady supply of the best drought blood in Texas. You get your land free and clear, and your bloodline whole, and your promises kept." He held it out. "That's not me saving you, ma'am. That's me making the smartest investment of my career. You'd be doing me the favor. Now, do we have a deal?" Martha stared at the paper. She read it slow twice the way she'd read the foreclosure notice looking for the trap, and there was no trap. It was fair. It was more than fair. It saved the land, and kept the bull, and kept the bloodline, and kept every promise, and it cost her nothing but bull calves. She'd have sold anyway, and it left Caleb Sterling standing in the wreckage of his own scheme, holding nothing but a paid-off note he'd never wanted paid. Her hands did shake now. She couldn't help it. "Mr. Reed," she managed. "Why truly? Why ride back down here and do this?" Harlan Reed put his hat back on. "Because 30 years of buying and selling, ma'am, you learn there's two kinds of people in this world. There's the kind that throws a dying calf in a wash because the numbers say to." He nodded down the road toward the Sterling place. "And there's the kind that carries it home because they can't do otherwise. And I've spent my whole life making money off the first kind, and I find getting old I'd like to spend a little of it standing with the second. That's all. It's not complicated. Now sign the paper before I remember I'm supposed to be a hard man." She signed it. And 8 days later, on the last day, the very last day, Sterling's note came due. Martha Whitaker rode into town in her wagon with Elias beside her and Sam Pike in the back, and half the valley falling in behind. As word spread, and she walked into the county clerk's office, where Caleb Sterling was already waiting, already smiling, already certain, already tasting the land he'd wanted for 3 years. She laid the full sum on the counter in front of the clerk. Cash, all of it, paid in full. The smile came off Caleb Sterling's face, one muscle at a time. "That's not possible," he said. "You don't have, where did you—" "Harlan Reed paid your note, Mr. Sterling," Martha said, and her voice was quiet and even and carried to every soul crowded in that office and spilling out the door into the street. "The Denver buyer. The one you tried to outbid for my bull. Turns out he'd rather do business with the woman who wouldn't sell than the man who threw the animal away." She watched it land. "You built a real fine trap. I'll give you that. Sell the bull and betray my people, or keep the bull and lose my land. No door out. Except you forgot the one thing, same thing you forgot your whole life." She leaned in just slightly. "When you spend years being kind to folks and asking nothing back, a stranger 3 days' ride away will settle your debts on nothing but your name. You can't buy that, Mr. Sterling. You can't burn it, and you can't foreclose on it. And you will never, ever have it. That's the note that came due today. And you're the one that couldn't pay it." The clerk stamped the paper, paid in full. It was done. And Caleb Sterling stood in the crowded office with his ruined scheme around him, and the whole valley watching, and he had nothing left to say, and nothing left to threaten, and nowhere left to stand. And he turned and walked out through a crowd that would not part for him gently this time, that made him push through that. Let him feel every shoulder he had to move. And he went out into the street alone. More alone than any man in Promise Valley. The richest man in the valley, and the poorest in every way that a paper note could never measure. And behind him, in the clerk's office, the woman he had called a fool stood free on land that was hers. At last, all debts paid, all promises, kept all accounts. Every last one finally squared. The clerk's stamp came down on the paper, and the sound of it was the last sound of Caleb Sterling's power in Promise Valley. Martha did not move from the counter for a moment. She stood with her hand flat on the paid note, feeling the ink dry under her fingers, feeling 3 years of dread lift off her shoulders, so sudden she near swayed with the lightness of it. Behind her, the crowd that had followed her wagon into town filled the little office and spilled out the door and down the steps into the street, and not one of them said a word, because they were all watching the same thing. She'd just watched a proud man walking out through a crowd that would not part for him. Sam Pike caught her elbow. "You did it," the boy breathed. "Mrs. Whitaker, you did it. It's yours. It's really yours now. "It's ours, Sam," she said quietly, and she meant it. And she turned to the room full of the people who'd emptied their burial jars and their children's savings and their bread money for her. "All of ours. Every one of you that put $1 in that jar, you come to my table this week, and I'll pay back every cent, because Mr. Reed's money settled the note, and yours don't need to. But I want you to know something." Her voice caught, and she let it. "I'll never forget who came to my gate when it was dangerous to. Not as long as I live. That's a thing a person carries to the grave." Tom Hollis, near the front, with his hat crushed to nothing in his fists, shook his head hard. "You keep our money, ma'am. Put it toward feed. Put it toward the babies coming. We didn't give it to get it back. We gave it because," the boy's voice broke clean in half, "because it was owed. And it'll always be owed. That's just how it is now." And there was a low sound through the crowd. A rough sound, the sound men make when they're moved and won't show it. And Martha had to look at the ceiling a moment before she could trust herself to speak. She'd have told you right then that the fight was over, that the note was paid, and the valley was hers, and Sterling was beaten, and all that was left was the living of a good long life on land nobody could take. She'd have been wrong, because Caleb Sterling was beaten, but a beaten man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous kind there is. And he had one card left. She hadn't counted, and he played it that very night. It started as a whisper, the way his poison always started. By the second day after the note was paid, there was a new thing being said in the low corners of Promise Valley, and it was so clever and so cruel that Martha felt cold when Sam first brought it to her, because she recognized the hand behind it, the way you recognize a man's walk in the dark. "They're saying you sold us out," Sam told her, miserable, standing in her yard with his young face twisted. "That the Denver man didn't pay your note out of kindness. That you signed the whole valley over to him. That the Whitaker line ain't yours no more, it's his outside money. And all these calves everybody's counting on Sterling saying they belong to a speculator now, and come the day Reed'll buy 'em all up cheap and ship 'em east and leave the valley with nothing." The boy's hands were fists. "He's telling folks you traded their future to a stranger to save your own hide. And some of 'em, Mrs. Whitaker, some of 'em are starting to wonder again." Martha stood very still. She felt the old sickness in her stomach, the same one she'd felt in the church, when he'd turned her kindness into a spider's trick. He'd done it again. He'd taken the one thing that saved her Reed's honest deal and twisted it into proof that she'd betrayed them all. "He's good," she said quietly, and there was almost admiration in it, the bleak admiration you have for a rattlesnake's speed. "Lord help me, he is good. He's beaten and ruined and folks won't shake his hand, and he still found a way to turn the very thing that saved me into a knife. He can't take my land now, so he's trying to take the one thing I've got left worth taking, my name, again." "What do we do?" Martha was quiet a long moment, then something hardened in her face. "We don't whisper back, Sam. That's his ground, the whispering. I've never once beat him in the dark, and I'm not going to start." She set her jaw. "We do it in the light, same as always. I'm going to send for Harlan Reed, and I'm going to ask that man to do one more thing for me, and if he's the man I think he is, he'll do it. We're going to read that contract out loud, every word, in front of the whole valley. So there's not one soul left in Promise Valley that can say they didn't hear with their own ears exactly what I signed and exactly what I kept." Reed came. He'd not gone far this time, he'd stayed close. Some instinct telling him the fight wasn't done, and when Sam's letter reached him, he rode back into Promise Valley within the week, and Martha put up the notice in town, same as before, that Martha Whitaker and Harlan Reed of Denver would read the terms of their agreement in full at the church, and that any man who'd heard she sold out the valley was owed the truth and could come hear it for himself. The church was full again, but the feeling in it was different this time, and Martha felt the difference the moment she walked in. The last time she'd walked that aisle, the room had been a mob half decided to break her. This time, it was a room full of people who'd taken their hats off to her, who'd emptied their savings for her, and who now, God help them, had been made to doubt again, and hated the doubting, and hated Sterling for making them doubt, and had come as much to be reassured as to accuse. Harlan Reed did not make a speech this time. He stood at the front beside Martha, and he held up the contract, and he said dry and plain, "Some of you have heard I bought your valley's future. that the Whitaker line belongs to Denver Money now. I'm going to read you what I actually signed word for word, and then you can call me a liar to my face if you've a mind to." And he read it. All of it. The plain terms that he'd paid Sterling's note. That in return, he had first right to buy the bull calves, the males, at fair market price for 10 years. And that Martha Whitaker kept every heifer, every female, the whole breeding line, hers and hers alone, forever. He lowered the paper. "You hear that? The heifers, the blood, the line that makes the line. That's hers. It was always hers. I couldn't buy it if I tried, and I didn't try because I'm not a fool, and only a fool tries to buy a thing a woman like that won't sell." He looked around the room. "I buy the steers, the bull calves, same as I'd buy 'em off any of you at market cash in hand. That's the whole of it. There's no speculator. There's no ship 'em east. There's a Denver buyer who'll be putting good money into this valley twice a year for the next 10 years, and a widow who kept every promise she ever made you, and one ruined man out east of here who'd like you to believe otherwise because it's all he's got left to throw." The room let out its breath, and then the blacksmith stood up, Sam's father, who'd been the first to take his hat off in that same room, and he turned and faced the crowd, and he said in his heavy, quiet way, "I'm done. You hear me. I'm done doubting that woman. She emptied her own pockets, keeping our cattle alive. She wouldn't sell that bull to save her own land, because she'd promised us its blood. She stood in this church and shared everything she had while a rich man called her a murderer. And now he's whispering she sold us out." He shook his big head slow. "Next man I hear repeating Caleb Sterling's poison, he can find another blacksmith and he can walk to the next county to do it. I mean that. We shamed ourselves once in this room believing that man. We're not doing it twice." And that was the end of it. That was the last poison Caleb Sterling ever poured into Promise Valley. And it died right there in the church, where all his poison finally died, drowned out by a blacksmith's plain word and a valley's shame at having doubted twice. But the twist of it, the thing Martha never expected, came after, when the crowd was breaking up and a man she barely knew shouldered his way to the front. It was Sterling's own foreman. The one who'd stood in the great house and heard his boss go white and red at the news of Reed's offer. He'd quit the Sterling ranch a week back, folks said, when the wages stopped coming, and now he stood in front of Martha with his hat in his hands and something eating at him from the inside. "Mrs. Whitaker, I got to say a thing, and I got to say it in front of everybody, or it'll rot in me." He turned so the room could hear. "The hay that burned, off your west field. It wasn't no cook fire, and it wasn't no accident, and it sure as hell wasn't you." He swallowed hard. "It was 2 of Sterling's men, on his order. I heard him give it. I stood in the barn and heard Caleb Sterling tell 2 riders to burn out the widow's winter feed and make it look like her own carelessness. And I said nothing because I needed the wages, and I've hated myself every night since." His voice cracked. The boy was right. Sam. The boy saw true, and I let him get called a liar to save my own coward hide. And I'm sorry. Before God and this whole town, I'm sorry. The room went dead silent. And here was the moment Martha saw it clear, where the whole valley could turn its newfound fury toward the ruined man out east and ride on him, burn him out, the way he'd tried to burn her. Drag him back for the law, make him pay in full for the arson and the lies and the 3 years of cruelty. She could see it in their faces. They wanted it. After all the shame of having doubted her, they were hungry to prove their loyalty with someone's blood, and Caleb Sterling's was right there for the taking. And Martha Whitaker did the thing that finally completely separated her forever from the man who'd thrown a calf in a wash. "No," she said loud enough to stop it. "No, we're not doing that." They turned to her startled. "That man burned my hay and called me a murderer and tried to take everything I've got," she said. "And I could send you all after him right now, and you'd go, and it'd be a kind of justice, and I'd be lying if I said part of me didn't want it." She let that sit. "But listen to me. Caleb Sterling has lost his ranch. His herds are dead. His men have quit. Not one soul in this valley will shake his hand, and he's got to leave the only place he's ever been. Somebody and go east to a brother who don't want him, and live out his days, a beaten, friendless man, remembering that a widow he called a fool built a bloodline off the runt he threw away. She looked around the room. That's the punishment. That's the whole punishment, and it's worse than any jail, because it's the one thing money can't fix and pride can't survive. If we ride on him, we make him a victim. We give him something to be angry at besides his own self. And I won't hand him that. I won't hand him one single thing more, ever again. Her voice dropped. We let him go. We let him carry it. That's how you truly beat a man like Sterling. Not by breaking him. By being nothing at all like him right up to the end, so that every day for the rest of his life he's got to measure himself against the woman who wouldn't stoop to what he stooped to. Let him live with that. It's the heaviest thing I could ever lay on him. The room was quiet a long time. And then one by one, the men who'd wanted blood let it go because she'd shown them a better thing than blood, and because they'd learned that long hard summer to trust that Martha Whitaker saw further down the road than they did. The rain came 3 weeks later. It came late, too late for Sterling's dead herds, too late for the cattle. Other men had lost waiting on it, but not too late for the valley Martha had carried through. It fell on grass that was already green and hay that was already stored and cisterns already dug, and Martha stood on her porch and watched it come down and thought about every man who'd told her the rain would save them in August and had let his stock die waiting on a mercy that came in its own time and not theirs. But the rain was not the end of the trial, and this was the part the valley learned that fall, the part that finally permanently silenced anyone who'd ever called Martha's careful ways a waste. Because a drought does not end clean. The rain came, but the range was ruined, grazed to the roots, its grass killed, and it would be a full year before the open range came back strong, and in the meantime, there was a hard winter to get through, and the men who'd lost their hay to the dry had nothing to feed on through the cold rain or no rain. Nothing that is except Martha Whitaker's system. You see it now, she said to Elias, standing at her fence in the first cold, watching the borrowed cattle graze her rested pasture. This is the part they never understood. The drought's over, and they think they're saved, but the range won't feed a soul till next summer, and half of 'em burn through their winter feed keeping cattle alive through the dry. If I hadn't rested this pasture instead of overgrazing it like everybody hollered at me to, we'd lose more cattle this winter than we lost all summer. And instead, Elias said slowly, looking out at the animals, instead, the valley comes through. Because one woman was called a mad woman for storing feed in a good year. Because one woman got called a mad woman for a lot of things, Martha said, and there was no bitterness in it anymore, only a kind of tired peace. And did 'em anyway. They came through that winter. The whole valley did lean and hungry, but alive on Martha's stored feed and rested grass and the shared system she'd built, every family bringing what cattle it had left to her pasture on the same fair terms, every other calf to Martha, the rest to them. And by the time the spring thaw came and the range began at last to green, the thing had proven itself so completely that no man in Promise Valley would ever again question the widow Whitaker's way of doing things. She'd been right about the drought before it came, right about the storing, right about the resting, right about the bull, right about everything the valley had laughed at. A person can only be proven right so many times before the laughing stops for good. Caleb Sterling came to her gate once that winter, just once before he left for good. Martha saw the black horse coming up her road through the cold, and she felt the old tightening in her chest, and Button lifted his great head in the pasture and turned to face the road, and Sam, mending a fence nearby, straightened slow and set his hand near his hammer. But Sterling didn't come as an enemy. He came the way a man comes when he's run clear to the end of himself and found nothing there at all. He reined up at the gate and didn't dismount, and for a long moment he just looked at the green-rested pasture, at the fat cattle, at the great black bull, standing calm and enormous, and watching him worth more than everything Caleb Sterling had left in the world. "I came to say one thing," he said, and his voice was not the churchyard voice. It was just tired. "I've lost the ranch. Bank's taking the rest. I'm gone east by spring to a brother I don't much care for, and who don't much care for me." He looked at the bull a long time. That morning, In the calving field. I've thought on it more than anything in my life. You know what I remember most? He met her eyes. That it didn't cost me a thing. I left him to die, and I didn't even feel it. That's the man I was, Mrs. Whitaker. A man it cost nothing to be cruel to a dying calf. A muscle worked in his jaw. And you carried him half a mile in the heat till it near broke you, and you did it anyhow. That's the whole difference between us. I've had 3 years to find a bigger reason than that, and there isn't one. You couldn't walk past. I couldn't be troubled to stop. Turns out the whole world hangs on just exactly that much. Martha looked at the ruined man on the black horse, and she found the anger was gone out of her, burned clean away, and what was left underneath was only a strange sorrow. You want the truth, Mr. Sterling, she said quietly. I never once wanted to ruin you. Not at the worst of it. All I ever wanted was to be let alone to work my land and keep my word. You did the ruining, every bit. You had 4,000 head and the whole valley in your pocket, and you spent it all trying to break one widow because you couldn't stand that there was a thing in this world your money wouldn't buy. She shook her head slow. That was never me beating you. That was you beating yourself. I just wouldn't get out of the way while you did it. He was quiet a long while. Then he nodded, once the smallest motion a man can make. Reckon that's so. And then lower almost to himself. What'd you name him, the bull? I never even heard. Button, for the white mark on his forehead. Sterling looked at the bull one last time. The coyote meat, the loss, the runt he'd thrown to the vultures, standing now in the last green pasture in a valley he no longer owned. And something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed his ruined face, and it was the saddest thing Martha ever saw on a man. Button, he repeated. You always did name things like they were worth keeping. He gathered his reins. You were the better rancher, Mrs. Whitaker. I should have seen it the morning you climbed that fence. Would have saved us both a world of grief. He touched his hat, and this time there was nothing false in it. Take care of that bull. And he rode off, and Martha never saw him again. He was gone by spring, as he'd said, and the great house stood empty a while, and then went to a young family out of Kansas who worked it small and honest and did well enough. And within a few years, most folks had to think hard to even recall the name Sterling, which is the fate in the end of every man who builds his whole self on other people's fear. The fear goes and there's nothing underneath, and he blows away like the rest of the dust. But Martha Whitaker's name did not blow away. It grew. That first spring after the drought broke, the calves came, the Hollis calves, the Decker calves, the get of Button out of the poor valley cows, and they came exactly as Harlan Reed had promised, big and calm and strong holding condition, where other calves faltered. And folks who'd once laughed at coyote meat now stood at Martha's fence and looked at those calves with something near reverence, and the terms she'd offered in the bad time every other calf to her began to fill her pasture with a herd she'd built for free, out of nothing but grass and mercy, and a bull nobody else had wanted. Tom Hollis's wife had her baby that spring, a girl healthy and hollering, and Tom came up Martha's road grinning like the sunrise to tell her they'd named the child Martha. We figured, he said, turning his hat, a girl ought to be named for the strongest person we ever knew. And that's you, ma'am. Ain't nobody else it could be. And Martha, who had buried a husband and never had a child of her own, and had long ago made her hard peace with that particular loneliness, had to go inside the cabin a while, and Tom Hollis stood in the yard and pretended not to know why, which was kind of him. The bloodline grew into a name of its own. The Whitaker line folks called it just as Reed had said they would, and it came to mean drought-strong, calm-tempered blood you could build a herd on and trust to carry you through the dry years. But it did not go unchallenged, and here was the twist that finally sealed the name across 3 counties, the trial that made the Whitaker line more than just a lucky bull's get. 3 years on, a sickness swept the county, a fever in the cattle that killed by the hundreds that took whole herds in a season that had ranchers burning carcasses from one end of the territory to the other. It touched every herd in Promise Valley. And Martha stood at her fence one gray morning, watching her own cattle for the first signs of it, her heart in her throat, because if the fever took the Whitaker line, then everything, the promise, the bloodline, the whole thing she'd built, died with them. The fever came, and the Whitaker cattle got it. And here's the thing that happened. The thing that spread out of Promise Valley to 3 counties and made the name for good. They got it, and they lived. Not all of them, but near all, where other herds died, to the last head. Whatever mongrel luck had built Button's blood, it had built into it a hardiness that carried his, get through a fever that killed everything around it. And when the sickness finally burned itself out, the Whitaker line stood in its pastures, thinned but alive, and the word went out across the territory like fire in dry grass. If you want cattle that live, you want Whitaker blood. Cattlemen came from 3 counties over then to buy the bull calves and study the heifers. Martha would never sell, and Harlan Reed came down twice a year to buy his steers on a handshake as much as a contract. And the 2 of them grew old doing honest business together, and their friendship was one of the plain good things of both their lives. Reed had said that first day that whoever threw Button away had made the worst mistake of his life. He lived to see just how right he'd been, and he never once let Martha forget he'd told her so, and she never once minded the reminding. Elias Bauer lived to see it too. That was the mercy Martha was most grateful for in the fullness of everything. The old German, who'd taught her egg and lard and molasses on the dirt floor of her cabin, who'd dug the crazy cistern beside her in the July heat and cursed Sterling in 2 tongues, who'd told her plain the calf would die, and then worked all night to keep it breathing. Elias lived long enough to sit on Martha's porch in the good years and look out over a pasture full of strong cattle, every last one of them carrying the blood of the runt he'd sworn would never make it to morning. "You were wrong, you know," Martha told him one evening, gentle the way you tease someone you love. "You must have told me a dozen times that calf would die. First night, second week." "I was wrong," Elias agreed placidly. Very old now, moving slow, having earned the right to admit anything a man cares to admit. "I have been wrong about a great many things in a long life, but I was wrong about the calf in the best way a man can ever be wrong." He reached over and patted her hand with his gnarled one. "I was wrong because you would not let me be right. That is the only kind of wrong worth being, Martha, the kind where somebody stubborn refuses to let a good thing die and makes a liar of every sensible person who counted it gone." He smiled, looking out at the cattle. "I have thought on it often. I hope when I go somebody is that stubborn about me." The smile went crooked. "Though I am past 80, and even you could not carry me half a mile." He died that winter in his sleep in his own bed, on his own poor quarter section, that he'd made produce through patience, when the cattleman swore it couldn't be done. Martha buried him along the fence line between their 2 places, so he'd always lie near the pasture he'd helped her save, and half the valley came out in the cold to say goodbye to the old man they'd once found faintly insulting, and had come in the end to understand was among the wisest souls they'd ever known. Martha put no fine words on his stone. Just his name, and the years, and beneath them, because she knew he'd have liked it best of anything. He knew that patient things outlast proud ones. And Sam Pike grew up. That was the last of it and the sweetest, and the part that made the whole long fight worth every hour of every hard day. The quiet blacksmith's boy who'd slept in her barn to help her watch the place, who'd given up 2 years of saved rifle money to help buy back her land, who'd stood in that church aisle, white-faced and shaking, and hollered the truth about the burning at a room full of angry men. Sam Pike grew into a young ranchman under Martha's hand, and there was never between the 2 of them any question of where it was all headed. She had no children. He had a father who loved him but no land to give. And the ranch Martha had built out of a dying calf and a stubborn heart needed someone to carry it on when she no longer could. Someone who understood all the way down in his bones, the thing she'd built it on. That you don't walk past that, you keep your word, that a rejected thing shared fair is worth more than a fortune hoarded and defended. She got to see the boy become that man in a single moment one spring, and it was the proudest moment of her whole long life. A cattle buyer came through, not Reed, a hard, sharp stranger, and tried to cheat old Widow Fenn's grandson out of a fair price on his Whitaker steers, leaning on the boy the way hard men lean on the young and green. And Sam Pike, near grown, now stepped in between them, and Martha, watching from the fence, saw her own self in the boy as he squared up and said quiet and level, That ain't a fair price, mister. And you know it ain't. And you'll offer this man market, or you'll ride out of this valley empty, and I'll make sure every rancher from here to the county line knows the buyer that tried to cheat a widow's grandson." And the hard man looked at the boy and saw something in his face he didn't care to argue with, and paid fair and rode on. And Martha turned away so Sam wouldn't see her wipe her eyes, because she knew in that moment that the thing she'd carried in from the wash 3 years back had grown into more than a bloodline. It had grown into a way of being that would outlive her, passed to a boy who'd pass it on again. She never had to ask him about the ranch, and he never had to ask her. It just became true the way the best things do, a little truer each year, until one spring evening when Sam was near 20 and running most of the place, standing at the fence beside her, watching the calves. Martha said it plain. "This is yours, Sam. When I'm gone, all of it, the land, the herd, the Whitaker line. I had the papers drawn up in town. It's yours." Sam didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said thick and low, "You saved my whole life, Mrs. Whitaker. That night you carried that calf home, you saved a lot of lives you hadn't even met yet. Mine's just one of them." And she put her arm around the boy who was a man now, and they watched the cattle together, and that was the whole of the conversation, and it was enough, and it was everything. Button lived to be old for a bull. He lived long past the drought, long past Sterling, deep into the good years, and he stayed gentle to the very last, following Martha across the pasture. Like the loyal dog, he'd always been leaning his great, gray-muzzled head against her chest, in the evenings, the way he had since he was a runt, too weak to stand on his own 4 legs. And when he finally lay down one autumn and did not rise, old and tired and full of years and honors, Martha sat with him in the pasture the whole day, threw her hand on his neck, exactly the way she'd sat with him that first terrible night on the dirt floor of her cabin, when the whole valley had counted them both gone. "You remember," she whispered to him low and steady as the day went long. "You remember what I told you that first night I told you you didn't get to quit on account of I'd told the whole valley I'd keep you, and I wasn't going to let you make a liar out of me." Her voice broke soft. "Well, you never did, old man. You never made a liar out of me once. You were coyote meat, and you built a bloodline that saved this whole valley. You were a loss, and you turned into the only thing that mattered. There's calves dropping strong in 3 counties right now carrying your blood, and there'll be calves carrying it 100 years from now, long after everybody who ever laughed at you is dust and forgot." She pressed her face into his neck. "They already counted us gone, didn't they? You and me both, and look what we did. Just look what we did." And she was with him at the end, the way she'd been with him at the beginning, so that the one hand in all the wide world that had reached for him when he fell was the last hand he felt when he went. She buried him in the pasture he'd saved under the good deep grass, and she put no stone on him because she had no need of one. She knew where he lay. The whole valley knew where he lay. He was in every calf that dropped strong in a dry spring, in every herd that came through a killing year that should have finished it in the name Whitaker that meant something now from one end of the territory to the other. You don't need a stone for a thing like that. The stone is the whole valley alive that would have died without him. And Martha Whitaker grew old on her land, the land she'd buried her husband on, and sworn she'd be buried on herself, and was in the fullness of years a good long while. Yet from the day she'd stood in that dusty churchyard and told Caleb Sterling to his face that she meant to be. She grew old, the quiet heart of Promise Valley, the woman the young folks came to for counsel and the old folks came to for company, the woman whose name mothers gave their daughters, the woman who'd proved a thing to a whole valley that the valley never once forgot and never will. And the thing she proved is this, and it outlived her, and it outlived every last soul who ever laughed at her. And it is the truest thing in all this long story. A thing is not worthless because a powerful man throws it away. A woman is not weak because she stands alone. The runt left in the wash, the widow on the poor land, the mocked and the doubted and the counted out. Sometimes when everyone with good sense has already walked on past. It is exactly the rejected thing, saved by exactly the one stubborn hand that would not let it die, that grows into the very foundation, the whole proud world is forced, in the end, to stand upon. Martha Whitaker knew it the morning she climbed that fence in the killing heat, and she spent the rest of her days proving it true. And it was true, and it is true, and it will go on being true, for as long as there is one single soul left on this earth, willing to cross a fence in the worst of the heat, for something the world has already thrown away.